Hi class, and welcome back to another lecture on Psych 242, Theories in Research and Personality. Today we're going to talk about the research for the humanistic perspective of psychology. So without further ado, really no new announcements for you. I have my office hours, but one thing to recognize is, assuming that you finished the exam by the time you watch this, you're now 2/3 of the way done with the course, so hang in there. We've only got a couple more chapters to go, and that will be the end of what we've covered in this class. But what we're going to cover today is 4 specific topics that the humanistic psychology perspective does touch on. Self-disclosure, loneliness, self-esteem, and solitude. So certainly a lot of really positive topics today. But let's go ahead and start with self-disclosure. In self-disclosure, the best way I've found to describe self-disclosure is, as the book says, is revealing intimate information about oneself and another person. And this person, when I was looking for something to put on the slide, Drizzy, thank you, Twitter, talks about intimacy as being more than just physical intimacy. It's being able to have somebody who to listen and comfort you, to be there for you, to care about you, and recognizing that when we talk about intimate information, we're not talking about scandalous information. We're talking about pieces of you that maybe you're not willing to open up and share with other people. And this is important for your personal growth and happiness. Part of this is understanding that you have a place in the world and that you aren't completely alone. And it's been acknowledged for its role in psychotherapeutic processes, and most people can recognize that just being able to talk about your problems seems to be very, very helpful. Now, we know this is a key role, or this plays a key role, I should say, in personal relationships, that most relationships with individuals involve these kind of deeper connections than just, I work with them. Otherwise, you're just kind of, work colleagues or whatever. This is rarely one-sided, though it can be. And what you see is that instead, most people tend to kind of go back and forth, sharing information at approximately the same level of intimacy. Most people don't walk up and just dump all their emotional baggage on you. However, I have personally been in that situation before, and maybe some of you can relate. But generally, people are willing to share kind of more broadly and less specifically. By broadly, I should say, kind of not like these specific details, but more just about who they are. And what you see about this idea of reciprocity is that when you're involved in a conversation and revealing information about yourselves, most people, again, do this at the same level, but not everybody, As we can see here, the @healthy living for hot messes hashtag or describes this as, I had to change some of the words, as you can see, but some people will just share. And what you see, though, is generally being able to disclose at a reasonably normal level leads to feelings of attraction and trust. And we don't mean necessarily physical attraction, though it can be, but generally this idea that's oh, you're somebody who I want to be around and like and enjoy. And you see this kind of as an increase as time goes on, that people are willing to share more and more about themselves to one another. What's also interesting is that, of course, friends and partners, romantic partners, are obviously going to share these secrets, these just intimate details about each other's lives. And it makes sense that people who know each other the most tend to have the highest level of disclosure reciprocity. These are the people you're willing to say pretty much anything to. And unsurprisingly, we know that communication is such a big, important thing in marriage. Specifically, being able to disclose in a marriage about yourself is a strong predictor of relationship satisfaction. And personally, as somebody who's been married, I guess is married, better than the past tense, it is one of the things that you got to recognize in why they say communication matters is the self-disclosure aspect. If you are upset or having trouble, being able to come to your partner and talk about that, even if it's with issues that you might have with your partner, Who knew that being able to share your feelings was going to be so important? Crazy, right? But the idea makes a lot of sense. If maybe you're not so comfortable with somebody, you're not willing to share why they make you uncomfortable. You're more willing to just kind of let it slide. But again, if you're married to somebody or living with somebody, right, roommates, things like this, you probably want to be able to disclose enough about yourself that you can feel comfortable around them. Also, I totally agree with this thing down at the bottom. Marriage really is just that. It's also just asking each other, what do you want to eat until one of you dies? Anyways, with men and women, there's some differences in disclosing, which isn't too surprising. Generally, society has probably conditioned you to think, we do see that women tend to disclose more intimately into more people than men do. The book talks about this point they make where the wife of the author says, he's like a woman about a friend because he discloses a lot more than most men do. And I would say that this is pretty true. This another great tweet somebody wrote is that dudes will know each other for 10 years and not have a single photo together. I have a couple friends like that, right? It's this idea that maybe men are less likely to get close to one another and share. We do know that men and women are more likely to be accepted when they disclose with their appropriate level of gender roles in society. So men typically are seen as less accepted if they are willing to what other men might consider overshare or share at a higher level more similarly to women. And women, on the other hand, are maybe seen as less accepted into a group when they don't share as much. So recognizing that this is also a function of the environment you grow up in as well. But another piece that I really appreciated them talking about, and I hope to have a nice conversation with you guys during class on, is this idea of traumatic experiences and exposure to traumatic experiences and disclosing that. So we know that people will often go through traumatic life experiences, not necessarily the most extreme, but things that might bother them. And being able to talk about those and share those leads to improvements in physical health and psychological well-being. And what was so interesting about this study is that this was the rest of the semester. They asked people, where's my laser pointer? They asked people how many times they went to the health center afterwards, and you see it goes up to like 1.25 on average for the trivial topics condition, where these individuals spoke about trivial topics versus just slightly over 1/2 of a visit per semester to the health center for people who discuss traumatic experiences with one another, suggesting that maybe there are some health benefits to this. And recognizing that this is regardless of the medium of disclosure. This could be in person, over the phone, even secret sites, if you've heard of Post-Secret, or maybe that's a little bit too back in the day. I don't know where I fall in ages anymore. But this seems to go hand in hand with the fact that concealing unpleasant personal information really isn't good, which would be similar to, I guess, Freud's concept of repression or, denial, is that these aren't healthy for us. It's important to be able to talk and understand this. There's a fantastic example that I've seen for coding, for people who code, like computer scientists, is when they're trying to figure out a problem, they will talk it out to usually like something like a rubber duck. So in my case, I guess if I really wanted to talk it out, I could talk to my brain and say, well, this is what I'm trying to do and how am I doing it? And even being able to just share things like that and talk out your feelings, what's going on, seems to help people to kind of reorganize themselves in a way that makes sense. So of course it would fall in line that being able to share these experiences with somebody you trust and care about, it's going to be helpful. So with all of this, disclosure at a appropriate level seems to be pretty good. Now, of course, you don't want to be the person who walks up and says, hi, my name's Kyle, and I'm about to dump some incredibly detailed life baggage on you. You probably don't want to do that, but finding that appropriate level of response is good. But let's move on to the topic of loneliness. And I found a couple pictures for loneliness, then I recognized that they were all about animals, which I don't know, I still like. But loneliness is very different than being alone, which we'll talk about solitude. Loneliness occurs when a person's network of social relationships, their group of friends or people they care about, is smaller or less satisfying than they wish it was. So it's very important to recognize that you can have a small group of friends, and if you're satisfied, if you're not feeling alone just by having a couple friends, good for you. You are not alone. Wonderful. You're not lonely, right? But if you feel like you have a big group of friends, or maybe that's not as deep of relationships, or maybe you just don't have as many friends as you would like, then that is going to be loneliness. And this is different by or per person. And the causes and consequences of loneliness, it's hugely impactful in terms of culture, recognizing that interdependent cultures have a very strong sense of self, where independent cultures typically, independent cultures have a stronger sense of self, and interdependent cultures typically are more community-based. So you would assume that somebody who is more split from the community in an interdependent culture might be a little bit more lonely. And what we know is that an individual's vulnerability to loneliness becomes relatively stable over time. So generally, how lonely you or how vulnerable you are to loneliness is something that sticks with you for most of life. However, of course, it can change. But what does chronic loneliness do? Well, high scores on chronic or on loneliness scales can lead to higher levels of social anxiety and self-consciousness, lower levels of self-esteem and assertiveness, maybe thinking you're less likely to have what you need, or think that it's okay that things aren't going right, or that you're not as good. Pessimism and negative mood, more likely to get upset or angry, things like this. And in the book, talks about different pathways between health-related issues with loneliness. So the book goes into more detail in all of these, and this is just kind of a quick overview, but recognizing that there are these different pathways and good reasons why chronically lonely people tend to have worse health outcomes, right? So, worse health habits, typically experiencing more chronic stressors, don't use as healthy of coping strategies, specifically, emotion-focused coping strategies. Talking to another person might be more difficult if you're lonely. Unhealthy changes in physiology, probably brought on by health behaviors. And recuperation, generally less likely to rely on kind of the natural restorative processes of the body. So what is the cause of loneliness then? Well, we talked about this as being less than, a less than ideal number of friends. But that's not exactly all it is, right? We can have negative expectations of social situations. So imagine you go into a social situation that you just think isn't going to go well. How's that going to work? Well, if you think about, if you've ever heard of the self-fulfilling prophecy, this concept, right? Say I walk into a party and I say that nobody here wants me, nobody here likes me, so why am I even here? I'm probably not going to look too happy. I'm probably not going to try to talk to people. I'm probably going to sit in the corner. If I'm lucky, I can find a cat or a dog to pet for a while. And then I'm going to disappear because that was a dumb party anyways. Well, of course, if I act like that, I'm not going to make friends. I'm not going to try to become less lonely or be able to become less lonely unless, I guess, people just walk up and start talking to me, in which case maybe I won't want to. The second second bullet point I really think is a good way to put this is that people tend to be poisonous when trying to develop friendships or romantic relationships. They tend to be self-defeating or self-deprecating to the point where it's like, oh, I don't think I want to chat with you anymore. Or it's like, oh, you seem like a good person. It's like, no, I'm not. That's probably something a lonely person would be more likely to say to poison or make it more difficult to develop a friendship. People might be led to interpret any small sign as rejection just because somebody said, hey, I gotta go. I've got a meeting to get to, but I'd love to catch up another time. They absolutely could have a meeting, but maybe you're more likely to interpret that as, oh, they just wanted to stop talking to me, so I'll never contact them again. Again, probably something a lonely person might do. But the other thing that I think is important to recognize is this idea of poorly developed social skills because, given everything we just mentioned up here, you're probably, one, not as well versed in social skills, and you're probably not going to utilize them in the most effective manner. And this might keep you in a cycle of loneliness. Now, this is nothing from the book. I did find this online. I find it to be very useful, right? That loneliness leads to this discomfort around others. You don't want to be there. You don't want to do this. So you avoid these, and you might turn to unappealing behaviors, things like health-related things. These self-defeating thoughts might lead to you to cause this poisonous relationship, or this poison any possible relationships. And this is going to lead to possibly depression at the most extreme, right? In the sense that, oh, so nobody likes me. This is going to lead to negative interpersonal behaviors, and others begin to avoid you as such, right? Recognizing that this kind of cycle might continue. So, right, recognizing what it is that makes people feel lonely and how to get out of that cycle is very important. But let's talk about something that bolsters or kind of assuages the effect of loneliness, and that's self-esteem. And self-esteem is more or less right, how you feel about yourself, how you evaluate what we call the self-concept, the self that you are. So we talked a bit about the real self and the ideal self and how those are similar, but maybe not totally cross for everyone. And recognizing, right, do you like the real you? We know that we want to be the ideal us, but do you like the real you? And this self-concept is this accumulation of what people see as their personal characteristics, their sense of self. And so, right, is this something that you think is a good thing? Is it need work? Is it a bad thing? And how does this affect you? And what we see is that people generally have relatively stable self-evaluations. However, this can obviously fluctuate. But when we talk about this, are more concerned with people's general level. Now, of course, if you fail to get into graduate school, your self-esteem is probably going to take a hit for a little bit, assuming you care about graduate school. Of course. But generally, we're talking about what is typical and on average. So another good example of self-esteem comes from this picture I, again, found online. So recognizing that low self-esteem individuals might underestimate who they are, they feel inferior, they might have low self-confidence. But on the other hand, high self-esteem people, which is different than narcissism, let me be clear, right, might overestimate what they can do, feel superior, have high self-confidence, and recognizing that we live somewhere in the middle of that, right? We might not estimate ourselves or accurately estimate ourselves. We might know what we can and can't accomplish or can and can't do, right? I have, I like to think, relatively high self-esteem. And just because I have relatively high self-esteem doesn't mean that I think I can, right, be an astronaut or do whatever. I mean, I guess I could be an astronaut. It's a little late, but I can, right, you should have reasonable limits on what you can do. I can't run a marathon tomorrow. I'm certainly not in good enough shape to do that. But that doesn't hurt my self-esteem, recognizing that, hey, I have faults. I'm not perfect. Oop, clicked a wrong button there. So what do people with high or low self-esteem think after failures? So after a poor performance on an exam, people with low self-esteem actually say, well, I must just be terrible, and don't try as well on the next test, and tend to perform more poorly and give up early. And this is in a lot of domains too, not just testing. However, high self-esteem people say, you know what, I must not have done so well, and will be more likely to work harder on that second test as they did the initial test. Suggesting that there is something that kind of lets you bounce back from failure with high self-esteem. And these high self-esteem individuals develop personal strategies for blunting, assuaging, whatever you might call it, this negative feedback. Now, it's totally reasonable to have some level of take some of the wind out of your sails if you don't do as well on an exam or a test as you thought. But, you do want to try to do better in the future. So with self-esteem and reactions to failure, I'm just going to put all of this up here. What we see in this, what the study in the book talks about, is that high self-esteem people, right, tend to do well on both these exams, even if they did poor, tend to try as hard on these second exams, no matter what they did on their first exam. And even with this negative feedback, they tend to kind of recognize that, well, it's okay. I can make it through anyways. Or again, like somebody with high self-esteem, or maybe the correct level of self. I struggle with that. This idea of high self-esteem doesn't always mean it's good, because you could overdo it. But generally, people with this higher self-esteem and kind of reasonable level of self-esteem are going to say, well, that's okay. I'm not perfect in everything, but now I know what I can do better. One other thing about this that I think is really important is this idea of contingencies of self-worth. So how is it that other people evaluate us, or how do we evaluate ourselves? So this is a two-step process that results in what we would say is global esteem. Because if you think about it, you can have esteem in specific areas. So you can have self-esteem in your ability to be a good son or daughter, to be a good academic student, to be a good community member, to be good at video games, to be good at whatever sports you play. But we can also kind of pack those all in together and create this global self-esteem. So we first identify domains that we consider important to us. So for me, that might be things like my family, my job, my ability to play video games, things like that. For you, those might not be exactly the same. They might be a little bit different. For instance, I'm not going to worry about my academic performance anymore, thank God. But you probably want to keep that in mind. And then we form evaluations about ourselves based on how we do in those selected areas. So typically, we look for areas that we're already good at. If I wasn't good at video games, I probably wouldn't put it high on my self-esteem. I, unsurprisingly, am not very good at sports, so I don't put that very high in my list of things that give me self-esteem. Now, there are important ones in our lives. Academics through high school. If you are a student who struggles and you're not able to, gain self-esteem in that area, you're going to struggle. And people who rely on uncontrollable self-esteem contingencies put their emotional well-being on the line. And what we mean by uncontrollable self-esteem contingencies are maybe like external focused ones. So having your parents like you, well, I guess if you have a good relationship with your parents, that wouldn't matter. But having your friends or everybody like you is probably a bad place to put self-esteem points in, because what you're going to want to do instead is recognize the fact that, hey, not everybody is going to like me. And, some people might have a bad day and seem grumpy, and they might like me, but it might not look that way. And I have no control over whether or not, you end up liking me, even if I put my best foot forward. So why would I make that such a core component of myself? Well, people want to be liked. That's one reason we do it. But additionally, we know that people who base their self-esteem on contingencies largely under their control have a lot better outcomes. And what kind of contingencies are we talking about here? Well, the book goes into a very interesting list of this, which I think we ought to discuss in class, talk about some that we see here and maybe where this list is lacking, or specific ones. One thing I did find online when I was looking is how they actually did this. And this is a little bit similar to Cattell's point of the factor analysis. In looking at these different models, where model 1 actually was, all of these are different questions that might be asked, and they all kind of fall into specific categories, which they claim are some of these. But when we look at this other model, they just put all of these questions as kind of a generalized system of self-worth. Again, if you're interested in statistics or understanding that how you would run a scale like this is pretty cool. But if not, totally understand. So why is it good to use contingencies of self-worth? We just talked about how it's important to have unconditional love, love without any conditions on it, without any contingencies, Why is it good to have contingencies of self-worth, though? Well, because, one, we don't have to be confident or competent in everything to feel good about who we are. We recognize that some things we're good at, some things we're not. Reminds me of that one Vine where the kid says, I love myself even though I look like a burnt chicken nugget. That, I think, is a great example of this. This also helps in understanding why some people have relatively stable feelings of self-worth. They've probably focused their self-worth needs into things that they have lots of control over. There's some disadvantages, though. People sometimes have difficulties selecting which of these contingencies they like. And sometimes people select contingencies that are difficult to achieve. So even if it's within your control, right? Going to graduate school and getting your PhD, as somebody who puts some self-esteem or self-worth into that, is difficult. It's not an easy thing to do. And so when you are struggling on these things, right, as graduate school tends to do, people might have trouble feeling like themselves or feeling like they've lost their way because, hey, it's hard, right? What I thought I was good at, I'm not doing well at anymore. And you can recognize why this can also be some disadvantageous, probably, and a couple other reasons that are more relevant to your own life than mine. The last thing to mention, though, as we already talked about a little bit, is this idea of how you get self-esteem through culture. And your satisfaction with yourself, your self-esteem, really just depends on what type of culture you're in as well. It's not everything, but it does matter. We see that individualistic cultures are more focused on these personal achievements, where collectivistic cultures maybe are more focused on this satisfaction from the relationships with others. So, not going to go into that too much, just going to move along and talk a little bit about solitude. So solitude is this idea, and really, right, this is kind of the other side of loneliness, right? You can be alone and not lonely. So let's talk about time alone and how we even measure this. So how do we measure people's time alone? Well, one way we can do is what is called an experience sampling method. Now, there's been a lot of ways to do this in the past, but one way that's gotten really used more recently and is worth chatting about is this idea of using your cell phone or using an app to do experience sampling. And so experience sampling just allows you to pull up your phone, look through, go through a quick survey about how you're feeling at the present moment. And this way you can get a measure of a lot of different things. For one, like, hey, how much time have you spent alone recently? Or are you alone right now? And you can use this in almost anything. They used to use daily diary studies, a lot, which they still do, a lot of interesting ways, but more or less you get a ping a couple times a day on your phone that says, hey, take our survey. So you just pull it up, take a couple minutes survey, and on your way. Now, the interesting, though, is people's reaction to time alone differs, right? Less pleasant than time spent with others for the most part. People find time alone. People often complain about loneliness and boredom when they're alone, and they eagerly seek out social interactions. Mostly, not everybody, but generally we as social creatures want to be connected. So when it comes to time alone, what you see is that with short periods of time alone, which is measured in, minutes, this is usually referred to as self-restoration. Like if you get home and had a long day, it's like, hey, how's it going? It's like, give me 10 minutes to like breathe and decompress. That is going to kind of allow you to emotionally renew, to feel a little bit better. Now, longer periods measured in hours, right? You say, hey, I just need some time tonight to figure out. These are usually used for working through personal problems and making important decisions. And this would be, again, if you are specifically looking for solitude. Right? So needing to work through these personal problems, and then extended periods measured in days, right? This is actually more of kind of going on a personal, like spiritual, possibly journey, but right, locking yourself in your room for a couple of days and either writing a paper, thinking, drawing, connecting spiritually. These are all reasons you might spend a large amount of time alone or days alone. And we also see that as time goes on in our lives, we tend to spend more time in solitude. Now, solitude is not necessarily a bad thing, as we said, as at least this quote is attributed to Albert Einstein, right? I lived in solitude in the country and noticed how the monotony of a quiet life stimulates the creative mind, suggesting that, the fact that I was living this kind of easier life made it really helpful for me to think. So again, some reason you might go into a solitude for a while. But people do sometimes have an inclination towards time alone, and this is likely a function of an individual difference. So we know that people who avoid solitude are filled with lonely, typically they're avoiding this because they are more likely to be lonely or sad, or they are people who tend to be very self-actualized. Right, with lots of friends, likely, and somebody who is generally better. It almost seems like if you don't like to be alone, ever, you're either really high on the self-actualization scale or really struggling with some things. On the other hand, people high in a preference for solitude, don't necessarily avoid social encounters, but they find positivity in being alone. And looking at some of the research in terms of free time that students spend alone based on how much you prefer solitude. So we have people who prefer solitude versus people who don't, and looking at these percentages. So see that people who prefer solitude spend about 20% of their time alone. I assume this doesn't include sleeping, versus closer to 10% of the time alone for those low in this. And look at this, how pleasant was your time alone? It was a 7.5 out of 10 versus a 5 out of 10, being a pretty big difference here. In percentage of time with others rated as pleasant, you see almost no difference, but a slight decrease here for people who prefer solitude. They might actually prefer solitude a little bit more than being in people. Again, this isn't to the point that they're going to run away from people, but maybe there is something joyous about being alone. The other thing here is talking about why you might enjoy being, some of the reasons you might enjoy solitude, Being able to problem solve, finding inner peace, talking about self-discovery or creativity. And lastly, the book also talks about things like anonymity, intimacy, and spirituality, but I am going to just leave these definitions up and let you guys go ahead and look at them on your own time. So that is the quick and dirty of this chapter. Excuse me, cat. That is all I have to go over today. If you guys have any questions, shoot me an email. Otherwise, I want to just chat a little bit about some of these topics in more detail and really more relevant to our own lives. So go ahead and be ready for that on Monday or Wednesday, whenever that might be. If you do have any questions, again, shoot me an email. Looking forward to talking to you guys then. And until then, have a great day.